Hello, I'm Richard Pears, a local historian, and my area of interest are the buildings of North East England. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about a building that no longer exists, but one that had quite a significant impact upon the major town of this area, Newcastle upon Tyne. It was called Anderson Place in its latest phase, but also called the New House and Grey Friars or the Friars in earlier period. And it occupied an area of about 11 acres in the centre of Newcastle. So to orientate you from this illustration of about 1705, we have St Nicholas's Church or the Cathedral over here to the south. This is Pilgrim Street running up here. Northern Goldsmiths stands on the corner here, where there was a set of almshouses called Brigham's Almshouses. And the town wall running along here follows the line of what is now Blackett Street. So Old Eldon Square is roughly this field here, and Gray's Monument stands roughly about here. And the site of the house is where the Lloyd's Bank on Grey Street is today. And you get some idea of the size of the orchards, the gardens around this house. It was said to be the largest private gardens within a walled town in Britain. Here's Corbridge's map of Newcastle of 1730, and I've outlined in red where the estate was. So an area called the Nuns, mainly field and orchard, and then the gardens closer to the house, which faced onto Pilgrim Street. So how did this estate come into being and this great house be created? This is a map of Newcastle from about 1200, and it shows the River Tyne at the bottom, the castle overlooking the bridge, and then the medieval churches of All Saints or All Hallows, St Nicholas's, St John's and St Andrew's. There were also two hospitals, Hospital St Mary's on Westgate Road, down here beside St John's, and the Hospital of St Mary Magdalene, roughly at the junction of what's now Northumberland Street and Percy Street. And we have Pilgrim Street and then Northumberland Street coming up here. We have Westgate Road heading over to the west, and then going past the castle, we've got the side, and then going up through the big market, and then Newgate Street curving round here, past St Andrew's Church. And the other feature, there was much an aspect of Newcastle until the 19th century, was the topography and how these very steep-sided burns that cut through the town running down to the river. So particularly you've got the Eric burn and the Pannon burn, but in particular the Lort burn and the Lamb burn. And this junction here of the Lamb burn and the Lort burn, this is the approximate area where there was a friary, and over here a nunnery of St Bartholomew. If you come slightly further forward in time to medieval Newcastle, see then the town walls have been built from the early 13th century, and we also have several friaries or monasteries, and we've got the Carmelite Friary beside what's now the Central Station, the Dominican Friary, what we now call Blackfriars, the Austin Friary over here, and we've got the Franciscan Friars at that junction of Pilgrim Street and what's now Blackett Street within the town walls. And then on the opposite side of the Lort burn, we had the nunnery of St Bartholomew's, which opened onto Percy Street as it came down through here, and Newgate Street and Percy Street rather coming down through here. So we've got these two areas of land, the friary and the nunnery, that it ultimately became the Anderson Place estate. What is interesting about the road network in Newcastle even today is that one might have expected Newgate Street and Percy Street to have followed the line of the Lort burn, perhaps coming past the church and following up here. It didn't. The road curved outwards, and that's almost certainly because the nunnery existed before the road, or the road was diverted to run around the edge of the nunnery precinct. So that bulge we have in Newgate Street today is a medieval feature of how the town was created. At the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the 1530s, the nunnery and the friary came into royal ownership. And we read Then in 1540, the nunnery was worth £49, 11 shillings and 10 pence. And there was a farm, lately the site, the Priory House of the Nuns, and all the buildings, orchards, lands and soil within the precincts, and 30 acres of pasture in the Vale of Jesmond, and also in Euston, a grange in the parish of Chesley Street. So the nunnery had land, not just in Newcastle, but in neighbouring villages and on the other side of the river in County Durham as well. And there's a very crude illustration of what remained of the buildings in Henry Bourne's History of Newcastle in 1736. So the buildings had survived until the 18th century to some extent. After the nunnery, we find some description of what happened to it. So it's said that the nunnery was in the hands of Lady Gavere, who sold it to Robert Anderson, and he pulled down all the houses, it becoming a receptacle for Scots and freemen. So these were people who were not citizens of Newcastle, who were setting up refuge, essentially squatting within the ruins. So Robert Anderson, bought it to dislodge them. And he also bought the garden and raised the dean, the Lord Burn that went through it, made it a very pleasant place. And this is now the property of Sir Walter Blackett. We also read in Henry VIII's records that in 1545, one of the major political players and merchants of Newcastle, called Henry Anderson, bought the nunnery. And he was Sheriff of Newcastle, Mayor of Newcastle on several occasions as well, and also the governor of the Merchant Adventurers, which was set up as a big trading guild. When he died in 1559, he had property valued about £2,700. That's nearly about £20 million today, so a very, very substantial merchant. And we also read in the will of his grandson, Henry Anderson, who died in 1605, that he owned the nunnery site, but he ordered all of his property in Newcastle to be sold after his death and the money distributed amongst his children. So who were these people? Robert Anderson, and in particular Lady Gavere, this lady who had the nunnery in the reign of Henry VIII. Well, despite Henry VIII breaking with the Church of Rome and ultimately going to war against the Catholic powers of Spain and France, and continuing to fight against the Scots, he recruited large numbers of mercenaries from Spain and Italy to fight against Scotland. And one of these was a knight called Sir Henry Gavere of Berwick. And he was the son of a Spanish knight who had come to England and settled in Lincolnshire, a place called Stennegot in Lincolnshire. Now, Sir Henry Gavere, after serving Henry VIII and Elizabeth, married the daughter of Cuthbert Collingwood, one of the major families of Northumberland at the time. And Mary is probably Lady Gavere who bought the nunnery. And we can say this because when Parliament had seized control of Newcastle and seized property of royalists, one of the petitions it received in 1651 was a lady called Dorothy Swinhoe and her daughter Eleanor Ord. And they asked for payment of arrears of lands called the Nuns in Newcastle, valued at £15 a year, which had been left to them by Dame Mary Gavere of Duddow, their mother and grandmother respectively. And these were owned also by Sir John Clavering. So Sir John was ordered to pay them an annuity for the lands. So we had the nunnery lands bought by Henry Anderson and then sold by his grandson and then bought by the Gaveras in the 17th century. But this was not Anderson Place. This was the site bordering on Newgate Street, not the site of the house close to Pilgrim Street. There is some evidence from this map of Newcastle in 1783, which shows again some survival of the buildings. So, for example, there was a theatre behind what's called the Knott Market here, but what we would now call Newgate Street, with the Nuns Lane, a building called the Nuns Chapel and Yard, and the theatre formerly the Nuns Mansion House. And this had a long room. And this very famous theatre and place of entertainment called Mr. Parker's Long Room, which stood attached to the Turk's Head Inn, just off Newgate Street. and we get some sense of the other boundaries as well, of other properties on the site. But clearly, even by 1783, there was some vestige left of the buildings of the monastery at the time, from the medieval period. Now, the Franciscan Friary was a completely different building and estate. It was also valued in 1540 when it was said to be a farm, site of the Brethren in Pilgrim Street, with buildings, orchards, little gardens, and a meadow near the walls of the town, about 3.5 acres. And this seems to have become the property of Robert Lewin, who was another member of the Merchant Adventurers Guild, who was Sheriff of Newcastle and Mayor, and also MP for Newcastle. Now, both Anderson at the Nunnery and Lewin at the Franciscan Friary had bought this land from King Henry VIII, acting through middlemen, essentially London lawyers who were buying up portfolios of property around the country and then selling it to local merchants for a profit. So this is how this land fell into private ownership. And Robert Lewin in 1562 left his youngest son, also called Robert Lewin, all my lands, rents and hereditaments in Pilgrim Street in Newcastle, lately the Grey Friars, so the Grey Friary, which amounted to about £8 per year. And in the wills, then the Lewins disappear, and it seems the next reference we have is to the Liddell family, who more famously owners of Ravensworth Castle, but they also began as Newcastle merchants in the 16th century. And Thomas Liddell died in 1577 and left in his will in the Friars a house of 2 chimneys, 1 bedstead, and a chest of maple and chest of wainscot, and also he had a cow and a byre, and he left this to his son and his wife, his widow. When his widow died in 1604, Margaret Liddell, she left to her son Thomas my place called the Friars, with the appurtenances, the yards and gardens around it, essentially, where he now dwells. So in 1604, Thomas Liddell was living in a house on Pilgrim Street, called the Friars. And this is more explicit in 1616, when Thomas also died and left to his son my house in Newcastle called the Friars, with the gardens around it, to his son Sir Thomas. Now it was this Sir Thomas who decided that, having grown up as a merchant and earned his living there and the family wealth from trade, would become a county gentleman, and he bought Ravensworth Castle and went to live there as a baronet in the countryside, but he kept his connections with Newcastle. And it seems that the house, the Friars, was inherited by his half-sister Jane Liddell, and she married a man called Robert Anderson in 1615. So this is where Robert Anderson comes into the story alongside Lady Gavere in Bourne's description. When Robert Anderson died in 1640, he left all of his property to a man called Sir Francis Anderson, a distant relative. Now, Sir Francis was descended from Henry Anderson, who had bought the Nunnery. He was a sheriff of Newcastle in 1641, and this is the point that the English Civil War had begun, Charles I versus Parliament. And like a true royalist and gentleman, Sir Francis raised a cavalry regiment to fight in support of Charles I, but he was captured in fighting in Yorkshire and held prisoner by Parliament. He was certainly not in Newcastle in 1645 because the corporation records paid a lady called Jane Barwick for keeping the grate or the fire going at Sir Henry Anderson's house. And the corporation appeared to have seized property belonging to the Andersons after the siege of Newcastle by the Scots in 1644. And they were particularly keeping the grate going in Anderson's house for this prisoner, King Charles I, who had been captured by the Scots, and they were bargaining with the English Parliament to sell King Charles I to Parliament to be tried. So Sir Francis had been captured and he was imprisoned in London. Charles was being held in Newcastle, and there's records of him playing golf on the town moor and also attempting to escape at one point but certainly it seems to have been held prisoner in the new house, as it was called at the time. Now, Sir Francis had been captured by Parliament. In fighting for the king, he'd drawn enormous debts, £4,700. And although with the restoration of the monarchy under Charles I's son, Charles II, in 1660, Sir Francis Anderson was able to become MP for Newcastle and gain some benefits that way, and Mayor of Newcastle twice, he couldn't really stave off his creditors and was forced to start selling some of his family lands. And he sold Anderson Place to William Beckett, another Newcastle merchant, in 1676. And Sir Francis Anderson left Newcastle and went to live at Bradley Hall near Ryton in County Durham. So to summarise, we have the two buildings, the Friary and the Nunnery, both seized by King Henry VIII in the 1540s. And the Friary was bought by William Earl of Essex and these lawyers, James Rooksby, William Ebegrave, John Cook, and Edward Rogers, and then appears to have come into being bought by Robert Lewin, and the Lewins eventually passed it to the Liddles and became called the Friars under the Liddles, and ended up with Jane Liddle down here. The Nunnery was bought from London lawyers by Henry Anderson and passed to his son Henry, and we then get Lady Guevara occupying it with her husband, Sir Henry Guevara, and eventually that passing down to Dorothy Swinhoe down here. And one of Henry Anderson's other sons and grandsons intermarrying with the Andersons, and eventually the house ends up with the Nunnery site ends up with Sir Francis Anderson. And just at the point he gained both the Friary and the Nunnery in about 1640 is the point where his fortunes went downhill with the English Civil War, and he then began to lose much of his property and money and was forced to sell it to William Beckett. He may have sold part of the nuns' lands to Mark Milbank, another Newcastle merchant, which was also bought by William Beckett as well. So two completely separate buildings end up in the hands of one family. By 1676, that's the Becketts, a very famous northeast family. And we get some sense of the house, the size of the house, from John Speed's map of Newcastle in 1610, where again we have the river at the bottom, the walled town, Pilgrim Street coming up here. There's the wall where Blackett Street is today, St Andrew's Church, and there's the estate with this oversized house drawn in the middle, clearly to show the importance of this enormous mansion. And it's called the New House on this plan. And that's just a very close-up of it there. So we have the Lord Burn cutting through the lands here, Pilgrim Street over here, and the gateway to the house from Pilgrim Street here as well. Now, what appears to have happened is something that we see elsewhere in Newcastle, that the monastic buildings, the Friary and the Nunnery, were kept in use. They were real estate that was very valuable. We have an example at Blackfriars, where we have the three ranges of buildings around the cloister still surviving. What Henry VIII did was to ensure that the church was knocked down, because he didn't want any return of the monks and their Catholic beliefs. So here at Blackfriars, the church, which was in the foreground, has been demolished, but the rest of the building is perfectly good and can be sold off or rented out. In this case, it was owned by Newcastle Corporation and still is. So we have to imagine that the friars and the nunnery buildings were also retained, and that's why they show up in those maps from the 18th century. And here is a plan of the friary or Grey Friars or the new house in 1749, which appears to show some remnant of that building, because there's a very thick wall running through the building, thick walls here, thick walls at this end as well, and an entrance porch down here. And if we look at Blackfriars, the east range of Blackfriars, this was comparable to what the plan would have been of the Friary, but in particularly the west range of Blackfriars, which is 88 feet long and 26 feet wide, compares quite well with that at Greyfriars down here, 92 feet long and 27 feet wide. So I think what we have in the core of this house, the Greyfriars or the new house, is the west range of the monastery that was retained and converted into a private house, probably by the Lewins in the end, towards the end of the 16th century. So we can see here retention of part of the range of the cloister. Then wings were added to it and a grand entrance porch was further expanded by filling in the space between. And then to get to the picture we showed at the very beginning, we have larger wings added on the side with more prestigious accommodation, and particularly with sash windows and flat roofs from which to see the town. So here is an illustration from 1707 showing the house of Sir William Beckett, and this is by two artists called Niff and Kip. And some of the features we see in this house we see elsewhere in buildings around the region. It's a beautiful house, very fine house, as you can see, but it's grown by adding parts onto it rather than a single rebuild. So we have the early 17th century house in the centre here, and then wings added by Sir William Beckett on this side. And we have porch with columns. We have these bay windows full of glass, very expensive, showing off his wealth. We have these ornate gables, flat roofs and cupolas, so you could get onto the roof and view the landscape around. And on these wings, we have the windows set in vertical panels like this. And we see this in other buildings nearby. So the porch, for example, this is a 19th century illustration of Anderson Place, the porch there. And it's almost identical to the porch at Belsay Castle, which we know dates from 1614. The columns are the same. The ones at Anderson Place have kept the globes on the top. They've been lost at Belsay Castle there. But other than that, it's almost identical. And a similar building, Horden Hall in Durham from about 1650, has an almost identical porch added to it as well. So we've got here an approximate view of the porch added to this house around about the first half of the 17th century. The bay windows, again, we can date to around 1600 or the first quarter of the 17th century. This is Walworth Castle, just north of Darlington, with a big Elizabethan and Jacobean bay window on here. This is Anderson Place down here with those bay windows, and Gibbside Hall. We have windows about 1605 on that one as well. And the shaped gables, we've got examples. Here's Anderson Place, but we've got those at the Keelman's Hospital in Newcastle from 1701, and also at this house on Rosemary Lane from about 1700 as well. So we've got some idea of the stylistic features that went into Anderson Place. With the flat roofs, the mansion house that stood on the quayside, paid for by the corporation in 1691, that had a flat roof covered with lead, and then cupolas, so spiral staircase going up to these, and then you could go out on the roof. We've got still surviving Alderman Fenwick's house in Newcastle, where you've got the cupola there, and although it now has a pitched roof with the pantiles, it does have a walkway around it as well. And this was so, as Celia Fiennes observed about Newby Hall in Yorkshire, you may see a great way around your country, so that you could go on the roof and look around and show off to your friends. In particular, Sir William Beckett, who built these wings onto Anderson Place, would be able to take his friends and show off all of the lands that he owned right in the centre of Newcastle and impress them with his wealth and prestige. And we have an example, Lady Clavering's house, 53 Westgate Road, still has these windows in these vertical stone panels that we see on that illustration of Anderson Place as well. So all in all, we can date the core of that house to about 1600, and it was probably called the New House because it had been recently built by the Liddles or the Lewins, and these wings that were added on by Sir William Beckett after he inherited the house about 1700. So the Blacketts, we have Sir William buying Anderson Place in 1676. He had two sons, Sir Edward, who inherited Newby Hall in North Yorkshire, and his younger son, Sir William, who inherited the Greyfriars, or the new house, or Anderson Place as it was later called. And he was also a baronet as well, and he bought Wallington. And again, this is another instance of a family who had made their wealth from trade in Newcastle, but deciding to move into the countryside because the town was industrializing, becoming polluted, so they wanted a space they could out in the countryside where they could entertain in more privacy. Sir William's son was also Sir William. He married a lady called Lady Barbara Villiers. Now, they didn't have any children. He did have an illegitimate child called Elizabeth Ord. So on his death, the estate passed to his sister's relations. His sister Julia had married a Yorkshire baronet called Sir Walter Calvary, and they had a son called Walter Calvary. And he is the one who married the illegitimate cousin Elizabeth Ord to unite the families, and they had one child called Elizabeth as well. And from them, Walter Calver's sister Julia married the Trevelyan's, who later inherited Wallington. And the second sister of Sir William, Diana, married Sir William Wentworth, and that passed to a man called Sir Thomas Wentworth Blackett, and he ultimately ended up inheriting Anderson Place and Hexham Abbey. And his descendants, the Beaumont Blacketts, later became the Lord Allendales, so very still around today. So we have one family buying it, but through process of inheritance, the various lands, Wallington, lands in Newcastle, lands in Yorkshire, being split up eventually. So Sir William Blackett, the first baronet, was a member of the Common Council. Again, he was a member, the governor of the Horsemen's Company, one of these major trading guilds, sheriff of Newcastle, and an alderman and mayor as well, and MP too. So a man of great power and wealth in Newcastle. And when he died, it was inherited by his son, also Sir William, called the region's second largest coal producer by the end of the 17th century. And he paid £4,000 for Wallington Hall, a huge sum of money. And he had an annual income of about £10,000, so a tremendously wealthy man at the time. And he probably extended Anderson Place to show off the new buildings that he had added on either side, the new wings that he'd added to the earlier house. So these are his additions. There's the house in the original house in the centre, the new house, and then Blackett added these wings on the side. So began laying out the gardens as well. And this is the rear view of it, where again we see these tall wings on the side with the flat roofs, and then the older house with sort of Jacobean chimneys in the centre as well. So this is the house looking from the gardens towards the rear of the house. Now, just a reminder just how wealthy the Blacketts actually were at this time. In 1730, when William Blackett was living in Anderson Place with his wife and daughter and servants, they owned this 11 acres. At the same time, the historian of Newcastle Bourne wrote that 14,000 people lived in 1,500 houses down in All Saints Parish, crammed in to these tenements down by the quayside, in the chairs along the quayside. In St Nicholas's Parish, 4,000 people lived in 500 houses. So many, many people living perhaps in just a room, a family occupying a room in some of these tenements. At the same time as the Blacketts were living in opulence up here and were beginning to develop Wallington as an estate as well. So William Blackett, the second baronet, he was something of a great spender, said to be better at spending money than making it, perhaps not the businessman that his grandfather and father had been. He did marry the Earl of Jersey's daughter, so was considered wealthy enough to do that, and he's the one with the illegitimate daughter. But when he died, his spending had left colossal debts of £77,000 at the time. Enormous sum of money that was inherited by Sir Walter Calvary Blackett, and he had to try and make good on these debts. Sir Walter Calvary took the name of Blackett on marrying his cousin, the illegitimate daughter. He was called the King of Newcastle. He was an alderman from 1729, mayor on several occasions, sheriff of Newcastle, an MP. As an example of the time, you had to pay huge sums of money to bribe the electors to vote for you. He spent £6,000 in the 1741 election. So much money, in fact, that he decided with the Ridley family, who had the other Newcastle seat, that after that they would not contest an election again. And there were no contested elections in Newcastle until Sir Walter died. So they tied up the politics of Newcastle between them. And he became a baronet in 1749. And he was a tremendous benefactor to Newcastle, paying for schools, paying towards the infirmary, giving money to the poor and buying food for the poor during poor harvests and during the winter, and sponsoring lots of charitable works around the region as well. And he is the one who developed Wallington, the National Trust house up beside in Northumberland near Morpeth. And this great opulence that we see here, we must imagine also existed in the house in Newcastle. Now, after Sir Walter's death, the estate was inherited by Sir Thomas Wentworth Blackett, his distant relative. Sir Thomas Wentworth was a man aged 57 who had an estate in Yorkshire where he was living with his mistress. He wasn't married, and didn't really want to come up and live in Newcastle. So he had the house in Newcastle divided into three, and we can see this on this map from 1783, so that walls have been built within the house. The bay windows have been turned into doorways, and separate gardens have been created around the house as well. So he was trying to rent the house out to make some money from different people, obviously recognizing that nobody would have the wealth to occupy the whole thing. He did attempt to sell the house to Newcastle Corporation in 1783, but they were unable to buy it. One of the great lost opportunities, really, of Newcastle's history, that this estate wasn't purchased then. It was bought, however, by a man called George Anderson, who may or may not have been related to the original Andersons. That's an open question. He was a builder and architect, and was described by John Dobson's daughter as the opulent builder. But he was a very wealthy man, and he was able to buy this estate. And he may have bought it as a speculation, really, to think about dividing it up and building upon the estate as well. And he lived in the central house. His daughter lived with her husband in an adjacent part in one of the other houses, and Dr. Pemberton lived in the third part of the house on the other side. So the house is becoming divided up. And George Anderson's family did continue to own it for several years. And here we see it in 1805, a closer view, where you can see the bay windows have been put through to make doorways in addition to the central porch. And we also have pitched roofs where the flat roofs have been before. So perhaps recognizing that flat roofs in the north of England are not the best thing with the weather. Now, the Andersons also began to develop lands in the country, and George Anderson's grandson, Thomas, in 1833 bought an estate out northwest of Newcastle called Little Hall, and also Kirk Hall estate, where Capability Brown was born. And he developed that house, a medieval tower house, possibly even two towers, expanded into quite a substantial mansion that the Andersons still live in today. So he bought this house, and he sold the lands of Anderson Place and the gardens, those 11 acres, to Newcastle Corporation in the 1830s for £50,000, another huge sum of money. So he was able to buy that property at Little Hall and Kirk Hall, knowing that he would have this income coming to him. And we have this map from 1835 showing the sale. Now notice that what is now Northern Goldsmiths is not part of the lands. This had been a medieval set of almshouses, Brigham's almshouses, that was never part of the estate. And just remember this lane down here. Okay, so there's the house, there's Pilgrim Street, but all of this land is now has been bought by Newcastle Corporation. And what replaced Anderson Place was Granger's City of Palaces, Granger Town as we now call it. And he laid out Grey Street and the surrounding streets were there, and lined it with these beautiful stone-faced buildings, shops below, and offices and houses above, to create a new commercial centre for Newcastle, and the new Granger Market and other features to try and bring more commerce into Newcastle by occupying this 11 acres of land that had eventually come into the control of the corporation. And so there's Gray's Monument at the focal point of this new development that we know today. And some of the buildings that stand on the site, so if we were looking at the front of the house before it was demolished, what we now have is this building that was once Waterstones on Grey Street, just down from Gray's Monument. And the site of the house itself, if we would be looking at the back of the house, we would now be looking at the front of Lloyd's Bank on Grey Street. So that's roughly where the house was today. There are vestiges of this estate left, however. Between the Tyneside Cinema and the other building I've just shown, there was that lane. The Tyneside Cinema and Northern Goldsmiths stand on the site of Brigham's almshouses, so we're not part of the estate. So the lane that ran alongside between the Priory Church, so you have to imagine the Priory Church, the east end of that, on the right-hand side here, then a lane, and then the almshouses in their enclosure here. Highfriar Lane is shown on our map. And so there it is there. This lane here is the lane that runs beside the Tyneside Cinema. So this lane is over 700 years old. It's been there as a property division. So it's Highfriar Lane. And George Anderson, Thomas Anderson, after he had moved to Little Hall Tower and the land was going to be built upon, he decided to commemorate his family's ownership of this area of land by putting up this Gothic style building. Unfortunately, now you can see the front has been replaced with a modern shop front. But this is at the Nuns Gate, the lane that runs from Newgate Street into what had been the estate where the Longhouse and others were. And here we have the shield high up, and that is the Anderson family shield on there as a reminder of the Anderson family's ownership of this estate. So Anderson Place was this tremendously large private enclosure within Newcastle that eventually gave way to give us the very fine buildings that form the centre of Newcastle based on Grey Street today. Thank you very much for listening.
Good evening from Gateshead Archive at home. We do hope you've enjoyed Richard's talk this evening, and we do miss hosting talks and events at the libraries at the moment. We are very pleased, however, to welcome Richard now to answer questions about Anderson Place live. And I've got a few questions already from Alan. So Alan wanted to know, the nunnery, has this any connection with the strawberry?
Good question, Alan. I'm not sure is the answer. Do you mean the strawberry pub up beside St James's Park? I presume that's the one you mean. Short answer is I don't know. The nunnery certainly owned considerable land in Newcastle, and it's possible that the strawberry may have stood on the land, but I'm not sure of the exact connection between them.
I also assumed that he meant the pub as well, and I wasn't. I wasn't completely sure.
If he wants to come back with what he thinks, if he thinks there's a connection, then I'd be really interested to hear what that might be.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, he has also asked what was the source of the Anderson wealth. I know you talked about the Blacketts having mined a lot of coal.
Yes, the two guilds that I mentioned, the merchant adventurers, was a guild of merchants who were entitled to export and import goods through the River Tyne. And you had to be a member of the guild to be able to do that. So these people grew extremely wealthy. And the other guild that I mentioned was the Horsemen's Company, and they had the exclusive right to export coal. So all of the coal being dug out of Wickham Parish and in Gateshead and in Ryton, and then on the north side of the river in Denton, all of that was supposed to be shipped out of the river through Newcastle Quayside under the auspices of either the horsemen or the merchant venturers. So it's really a huge monopoly of a handful of families like the Andersons, the Ridleys, the Blacketts, and others who are the ones controlling trade through Newcastle. So if you're a member of one of these guilds, you have the means to become extremely wealthy indeed. Particularly in the 18th century, when you have a jump, almost doubling in the amount of coal being exported through the River Tyne between 1700 1799, where you end up by the end of the century with about 1.2 million coal a ton being exported, out of the River Tyne. So this is the wealth. It's being able to control all of the goods that come in, whether that's food or linens or drink or particularly coal is the one that makes the money for these families.
So it's the trade rather than always the mining, is that right?
Well, they own that. Many of these families owned the land on which the coal was being mined as well. So I mentioned about the Andersons owning a part of Euston Parish. That's almost certainly because they thought there was coal there.
Right.
And if you look at Wickham, you have everybody from Earl Bute to many different families wanting to buy land in Wickham Parish, because in 1600 Queen Elizabeth was told, "Ye township of Wickham standeth on a mountain of coal." Wickham was the most important coal mining area in the known world in 1600. So controlling the trade on coal makes these people super wealthy.
Wow, that's really interesting. And Alan is also asking if William Blackett was connected with the slave trade.
Almost certainly, yes. The Blacketts, for example, were importing sugar. In fact, I think it'd be difficult to be a major merchant and landowner in 18th century Britain or 17th, 18th century Britain and not be involved in the slave trade in some way or other, whether it was leasing ships to be used in the slave trade or whether it was bringing in products from slavery, or Ambrose Crowley, who had his ironworks in Swarwell and Winlayton Mill, was a Quaker. He would not make guns for the Royal Navy, but he was quite happy to make chains for slave gangs and anchors for ships and things. So slavery is just part of the economy. In some way that people have. They're speculating by buying land in the West Indies, plantations. If you look at a lot of the records of these families, they refer to the plantations they have in West Indies, and that pays for some of these grand houses to be built as well. It is unfortunately, that it's very difficult to get into the mentality of these super wealthy people who thought it was perfectly okay to be involved in the slave trade, and also thought it was perfectly okay to send young children down coal mines. They made their money from, things we'd find utterly reprehensible today.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting to just try and think about the scale and how sort of deeply permeating those practices were back in those days. It's not individuals per se, it's a system.
It's an entire, economy is based upon, somewhere along the line, people had shares in ships that were involved in, if not actually taking the slaves from Africa, but they were bringing goods from the Americas back to Britain. So anybody who had mahogany doors, you don't get mahogany in Durham or Northumberland. That's coming from the Caribbean. Um, Anybody who has sugar, if you put sugar in your tea, that's a product of slavery. So this is, there's a sugar refinery in Bladen in the 1750s. Well, that's operating on the products of slavery. I don't know if anybody has seen David Olusoga, the historian who does, program about house histories, and he made the
Yes.
point in a talk I listened to in Newcastle where he said, the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution in Lancashire with all the cotton mills. Where in Lancashire do you grow cotton? The whole of the British economy is based upon products of slavery, and people grew extremely rich from that and from other, business and industrial practices that, as I say, today we would find completely reprehensible.
That's really interesting and a kind of a different perspective to have on it. So thank you for that. Alan has got back to us, and he says he did mean the Strawberry Pub.
Mm-hmm.
He'd heard a tale that a nunnery on that site had survived into the 19th century and sold strawberry wine, and he was wondering if that was true.
I don't think no nunneries survived after 1540. There may have been, no medieval nunneries would have survived. Henry VIII was, determined to close them all down. There may have been once sort of Catholicism is re-established in England in the 1830s. There might have been houses owned by, nuns. For example, there's a convent off Westgate Road, Summerhill Square, in Newcastle, and St Mary's Cathedral and things. But I don't think it wouldn't be a medieval nunnery. And actually, there was no record of one being there, as I showed on the map. It's known quite well where the monasteries, nunnery, and friaries were within Newcastle. What I suspect it might be is that people, it might have been a parcel of land that was owned by the nunnery or one of the friaries, but there wouldn't have been a medieval, nunnery surviving beyond Henry VIII's reign or the reign of Elizabeth I.
Thank you for clearing that up a little bit there. So Anthea asks, was Elizabeth Ord a member of the Ord family of Fenham Hall?
Thank you, Anthea. This is it's very difficult with some of these names like the Andersons and the Ords to work out their relationship. Even the Andersons who live in Little Hall today are uncertain of their relationship. Their ancestor was George Anderson, who bought the Anderson place in 1780s. They are not sure whether it's the same direct line of Andersons from the man who bought the nunnery from Henry VIII. So there's different spellings, and I think the Ord of Walter Blackett's or William Beckett rather, his daughter, may have been to do with there's a place called East Ord near Berwick, and there's also an Ord family spelled O-R-D-E, and there's a family spelled O-A-R-D as well. So there's quite a few. They might be, to do with the Ords of Fenham, but very difficult to disentangle, and particularly as the girl was illegitimate, it's quite difficult to pin that one down.
Okay, thank you. Anthea also asks, was something removed from Anderson Place and moved to Sheriff Hill?
Yes, the gateway from Anderson Place that was on Pilgrim Street, I believe is in Sheriff Hill. So that's another vestige of the estate that survives, although not in Newcastle. And some of the fittings of Anderson, when Anderson Place was sold in 1835 to be demolished, there was a huge sale, and so people bought artworks. The Andersons took some of the features, one of the smaller staircases and some candle sconces and things up to Little Hall Tower. The main staircase was a huge sort of 17th century structure, That is currently dismantled and in the attic of the manor house at Brinkburn Priory, where it seems people who owned Brinkburn Priory Manor House in the 1830s bought this staircase without realizing it was far too large to go in their small manor house up at Brinkburn Priory. So it has stayed for 150 odd years, now 200 years, in the attic there, awaiting reassembly at some point. So yes, bits of this estate was sold off. Um, Much of the stone, I assume, was just recycled into whatever Granger was going to build. Either as rubble or building foundations. You know, so bits of it pop up all over the northeast.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Now we'd have a question from Rachel. Was the development of Granger Town controversial at the time?
Good question. There were people who objected to it, but not as many as you would think. I think the corporation at the time, I've alluded to these trading guilds, the merchant venturers and the horsemen. And the other power that these people have is that they are also the politicians. These are the Common Council, effectively Newcastle Council. The corporation is these merchants. They control the trade for the town and its economy, but they also control the politics. So between 1700 and 1800, only two mayors of Newcastle were not a member of either the merchant venturers or the horsemen. So they control everything about the town, and that lasted until 1835, when the Municipal Corporations Act was passed, and this old corporation was abolished, and more men were allowed to vote. Think of the Great Reform Act, Earl Grey and his monument, that increased the number of people who could vote, and so it began to break the power of this sort of oligarchy, this group who controlled everything. They haven't gone away. These families are still around, living in country houses around us today, but and the guilds still exist. The merchant venturers certainly still exist, but they had pretty much tied up the politics of the town. So people who complained in the papers really had little power to do anything about it, and they could do what they wanted. They could just, demolish us. And I think it was sold quite effectively to the people that it would be this fantastic new business opportunity with all these new shops and houses and beautifully built. So people could see this would be an opportunity for more trade in Newcastle, on what was effectively a virgin site. With all those gardens, they were just going to be built over to make these new streets and very fine buildings.
Wow, it's hard to think about it, but how big that changes when you kind of wander around town. And well, we used to wander around town anyway. So talking about what it was like sort of physically in town, I just wondered, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the Lord Burn ran the land, and you say that the dean was raised, and I just wonder how big a job that was, and were there similar works going on in other places?
I think yes, one of the Newcastle and Gateshead, to some extent, of course, stand on the edge of the cliff of the River Tyne, and it is quite a cliff in places. If you think of Bottle Bank in Gateshead, in Newcastle, these deans, these ravines, effectively, where the Lort Burn and the Eric Burn ran down, were very steep, used as rubbish dumps, but also meant it was very difficult to move from east to west across Newcastle, because you only had High Bridge. The road is now named after the medieval bridge that is now buried under the road, and Low Bridge, which are still there as well. So these were the way of getting across the ravine of the Lort Burn. And this was a situation until the 1780s, when an architect called David Stevenson, who designed All Saints Church in Newcastle, turned his hand to town planning, and he culverted over the Dean, the small river running down the Lort Burn, from the quayside up to what became Moseley Street and Collingwood, Moseley Street, and gave us Dean Street, named after the Dean that is beneath it. And then built more shops along there. So again, you have this model before Granger, you had Stevenson. So, you know, this was a big job to do. Yes, certainly to build a culvert to contain the burn running downhill, and then you know, flatten over it, to make a roadway and build houses and shops there. And then once Anderson Place became available in the 1830s, they could complete that picture by filling in the top part of the Dean and building the streets. But it all depended on Stevenson's work in the 1780s. Stevenson's completely a bit of a forgotten figure in Newcastle and Gateshead history, indeed. That actually Granger Town would have just ended in a ditch, frankly, quite bluntly, you know, that would have ended in the ravine of the Loch Burn, had Stevenson not done the work of getting the roadway from the quayside up to the higher ground in Newcastle. And Stevenson is also responsible for Church Street in Gateshead, where before he started work there in 1790, the way to get from the bridge across the river was up Bottle Bank, very, very steep, or up Hypewell Gate, very steep ways up the hill. So Stevenson laid out that rather more gentle curve that is Church Street as a way of getting on the Gateshead side from the riverside up to the higher ground as well. But these were big works of big feats of civil engineering, which we've just forgotten about because we just walk across them now and go shopping there and drive our cars, or, you know, when we could do these things, as you say. It's all beneath our feet now.
That's great. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of thanks to pass on here. Beryl says, very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beryl.
Leanne, thank you, Richard. Very interesting talk. Very fond of your academic work, and this talk did not disappoint.
Oh, well, thank you, Leanne. Thank you very much.
So
I hope we can
nice.
meet people in person at some point, you know. But thank you very much, everyone.
That's lovely. Well, I think maybe it's time to wrap it up at this point. Thank you so much for coming along. We've had, we look forward to welcoming you back in March. And next week we have John Sadler talking about the Home Guard. So we do hope that you'll be back next Tuesday. But in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and thanks for posting all of those interesting questions. It's been really good to have a nice variety of questions. And we've got a last little comment from Jill. Brilliant, Richard. Thank you. So on that note, I think we'll finish up now and see you all again next Tuesday.